What you need, said Edward, is a deputation. He explained what that was. Percy ran back quickly. Edward says that we need a deputation, he told the others. Of course, said Gordon. The question is, what is a desperation? Asked Henry. It's when engines tell the Fat Controller something's wrong and ask him to put it right. Did you say tell the Fat Controller? Asked Duck thoughtfully. There was a long silence. I propose, said Gordon at last, that Percy be our, disputation. Hi, squeaked Percy. I can't. Rubbish, Percy, said Henry. It's easy. That's settled then, said Gordon. Poor Percy wished it wasn't. This is an excerpt from The Deputation, the final story of the Railway series book, The Twin Engines, and the 17th episode of Thomas and Friends Season 2. Many people know my love for the Scottish twin engines Donald and Douglas, and I have mentioned them in previous videos. But what you may find ironic is that The Deputation is my favourite story from their standalone book, but it doesn't actually involve them that much. In my opinion, The Deputation is an underrated gem of the classic era of Thomas and Friends, and here's why. For those unfamiliar with the story, as always, let's break it down. Donald and Douglas rescue Henry from a snowdrift, but are worried because the Fat Controller is returning to the island of Sodor soon. Given the mistakes that they both made in Brake Van, Donald a broken signal box, and Douglas crushing said Brake Van, they're worried that they'll be sent back to Scotland and in turn be scrapped. The other engines believe that this isn't fair and want to help them, but they don't know what to do. Until Percy decides to talk to Edward, who tells them that what they need to do is a deputation, which is where engines tell the Fat Controller that something is wrong. The engines in turn nominate Percy to do this, and even though he is absolutely terrified, he does it. Later on in the sheds, the Fat Controller tells them that while he does not approve of interference, Donald and Douglas are here to stay, which is greeted by a chorus of cheers and whistles. A brief summary, but it tells you exactly why I love this story. With Donald and Douglas frightened that they're going to be scrapped, the engines band together and take action to save their comrades from being scrapped. Thomas and Friends may be seen as a kid's show, but the real life implications are presented to the viewer front and centre. If the engines don't try and do something, Donald and Douglas will be sent home to be scrapped, which for a steam engine is the equivalent of being put on death row. The engines realise that this fate could not only befall Donald and Douglas, but it could also befall them as well, as they have recently had a scare with the revolutionary Devious Diesel, who came to Sodor and caused chaos in his 3-story arc. Yes, he was proved to be a wrong'un, but it still opened the door for more Diesels coming to Sodor, and 2 of them show up in this season alone. So the engines know that if the Fat Controller does send Donald and Douglas home to certain death, he can do it to any one of them if they step out of line. It also shows that while the Scottish twin engines' time on Sodor has been brief up to this point, they've made a good impression on the other engines, with their work ethic and their can-do attitude. This is shown more in the Railway series book rather than the TV series because of the cancellation of the episode Hello Twins, and that would have shown those character traits. But during their time on the island, they've earned the respect of Gordon, Henry and James, which are the big 3 of the Railway series, Duck, the hard-working city boy who'll defend the little guy, and Percy, who may not say much during their initial introduction, but is the only one who actively goes out to try and save them. Speaking of Percy, this is a great story for him as a character, and emphasises how much he has grown since his introduction in Season 1. When Percy first arrived on Sodor, he was a cheeky little engine who liked to wind up the bigger engines and got himself into a lot of trouble. And while we have seen his determination in stories such as Percy and Harold and Duck takes charge, as well as Percy's promise, if you follow Railway series canon, this is where we see the most growth from him as a character. At this point in the franchise, all of the engines agree that something must be done to help Donald and Douglas, but none of them have a clue about what to do. And if Percy hadn't have went and talked to Edward about it, I don't think the rest of the engines would have done anything to save them. Sadly, this happens a lot in real-life workplace situations. A decision is made by the higher-ups, the employees aren't happy about said decision, they agree that something must be done against this injustice, but when it comes to taking action, they don't have a clue what to do, and in turn, do nothing. Sad, but true. If Percy wasn't in the sheds at this point in the story, I don't think anyone would have went to the Fat Controller about the perceived injustice that was about to befall them. Gordon, James and Henry all talk a big game, but when it comes to taking action, and especially after their failed attempt at a coup in Trouble in the Sheds, they would of course be hesitant to challenge the Fat Controller for a second time. Duck might have went to Sir Topham if this had happened earlier in the season, but bear in mind he's just got back in the good graces of the Fat Controller, after not only leading a rebellion and Duck takes charge, but he wasn't exactly entirely innocent during the events of Pop Goes the Diesel, and that in turn led to what happened in Dirty Work and A Close Shave. So he would be more self-conscious about going up against Topham for a third time. How many times can you fight the good fight when everything is starting to wear on you? Yes, Percy has had his brushes with the Fat Controller, especially in Percy and the Signal, and Duck takes charge. But what he has that the other engines don't is a youthful spirit. When you're young, you only see things in black and white. They're either right or wrong, good or evil. When you're older, the shades of grey start to bleed in as life kicks you around a little. And in turn, you're more afraid to do things as an adult that you would do if you thought of it in the lens of a child, and you're less likely to take action on it. Percy believes what's happening to Donald and Douglas is wrong. He wants to do something, but doesn't know what to do, so he goes and speaks to someone who can give him advice on what to do, and that is Edward. You could argue for Thomas seeing life through this particular lens as well, but I would say he's more akin to a teenager / young adult at this point in time. He knows enough to know better, but has that sense of entitlement which is beyond his years, so he won't risk his burgeoning reputation being tarnished until the next episode. The only downside to Percy's plan, and what he didn't expect when he reported back to the other engines about said plan, was that they were going to throw him under the bus and make him go and do the job himself. This is a massive dick move by the big engines, but when you think about it, it does make sense for them to do this. Again, I'm thinking from a workplace environment. If someone comes to the masses with an idea of how to improve a situation, the reaction from said masses is always the same. Okay, you go and do it and let us know what happens. This is down to the fact that they don't want their names tarnished and suffer the consequences of this idea if Percy gets absolutely railroaded by the Fat Controller. Gordon doesn't want his express taken off him. Henry doesn't want to be bricked up in the tunnel again. James doesn't want to be put on slow goods trains. Donald and Douglas can't go to the Fat Controller about it, as they are the engines in question and it would be a conflict of interests. And we've already established Duck's reasons for not doing it. But if Percy's meeting with Topham goes well, and the engines wind up staying as a result, they can all applaud Percy and say, I knew you could do it. That's why we wanted you to go and do it. So the other engines can be seen as taking credit for a situation that honestly, they had no involvement in. In workplace settings, this is known as covering your ass. And that is exactly what the engines are doing in this scenario. You would learn so much about office politics from watching this one episode of Thomas and Friends than you would in an entire week of work experience. And it prepares you for the internal conflicts and office politics of the working environment. Where this differs from work, however, is that when Percy goes to speak to the Fat Controller about it, he actually listens to him. Don't get me wrong, this is entirely down to the fact that Sir Topham Hatt has already came back from the mainland and decided to buy Donald and Douglas. So he doesn't necessarily need to hear what Percy has to say, but it's still nice that the Fat Controller took the time to listen to one of his engines when he had a concern. This episode really shows how much Topham cares about his engines. With the troubles that Donald and Douglas caused while being on Sodor, he had every right to send them back to Scotland. It did look like Douglas was the front runner until Donald knackered that signal box, but I don't think he would have sent only one engine away, especially at the end of Breakvan. Twins have a bond that no one will understand, unless you are a twin. So even if the Fat Controller made the decision to send one of them home, the other one would insist on going home with them as well, even if it meant that they both suffered the curse torch. I know this from having twin boys myself. My sons are inseparable, and no matter how hard you try to split them up, if they don't want to be split up, they will not be split up. The Fat Controller is not an idiot, at least not in this iteration, so he can see the bond that Donald and Douglas have, and how foolish it would be to try and break it. Topham would also know the benefits of keeping both engines on the island of Sodor, as they relish clearing snow where other engines would bitch and moan about it. They're both hard workers and have already forged strong bonds with the other engines on the island. To send them packing would crush the morale that has been slowly building back up since the diesel incident, and that could lead to even more disturbances on Sodor, which is what the Fat Controller does not want. So while Topham may be out of pocket in the short term, having Donald and Douglas around is long-term planning that definitely pays off in the end. The Deputation is not an action-packed episode, but it is a necessary episode in terms of character development. Percy continues his growth as a character. Sir Topham Hatt shows how much he cares about the engines on his railway, and Donald and Douglas get to remain on the island of Sodor. Both engines go on to become mainstays of the show, and are involved in key moments going forward, especially Douglas, who saves Oliver from scrap in the following season. I talk about thinking man's episodes a lot on this channel, because I love episodes that make me do just that. An episode that's heavy on action can be amazing, but only if the story behind it has stakes that have been built upon beforehand. Old Iron and A Close Shave are some of the best examples of this. On the other hand, an episode heavy on action for action's sake is pointless and unnecessary. We have no reason to invest our time in it. That's something I feel that some of the later episodes had a problem with. They had something missing, and that thing was a story. I would much rather watch an episode that has no action but engages my brain with good storytelling and thoughtful dialogue. I don't want to watch episodes that are all style and no substance. And that is why I think The Deputation is one of the most underrated gems of Thomas and Friends. To everyone that's watched this video, thank you for doing so, and let me know in the comments what you think about The Deputation. But until next time, keep on chugging.